Good morning. When Dagny arrives in Galt's Gulch for the first time, Hugh Axton mentions to her that she could compare her situation to meeting all the great men from the past centuries in heaven. And Ken Daniger remarks, if you met those great men in heaven, what would you want to say to them? Just hello, I guess, she responds. That's not all, said Daniger. There's something you'd want to hear from them. I didn't know it either until I saw it for the first time. He pointed to Galt, and he said to me that I knew what it was that I had missed all my life. Miss Taggart, you'd want them to look at you and to say, well done. She dropped her head and nodded silently, head down, not to let them see the sudden spurt of tears to her eyes. All right then, well done, Dagny. Well done, too well. And now it's time for you to rest from that burden which none of us should ever have had to carry. Why does Dagny need to hear this? She's a purposeful, integrated, ambitious individual. She knows what she wants and what she's capable of. She has self-esteem and knows that she's worthy of happiness. So what is the precise value that she gets from hearing Daniger say this? And why does it impact her in such a strong way? I think the answer to this question, why Dagny needs this recognition from Daniger, gives us a key insight into the philosophical value and meaning of friendship and the specific need that we have for it. This is particularly important to think about because many people go through life in such a way that friendship simply happens to them or doesn't. So for example, people stay friends with people they happen to grow up with or were geographically close to, simply on that basis. Others might be somewhat more intentional in how they pursue friends, but do so from a relatively superficial perspective. For example, thinking that, or choosing friends on the basis of advancing a career or elevating a social status. But as many of us here are aware, friendship is an enormous potential value, an enormous potential spiritual value. Think about how much richer our lives are when we spend time with people that we respect, love, and admire, whose well-being we are deeply invested in, and who we love spending time with for their own sake. Now, part of what motivated me to do this talk and why I think it's worth thinking about in particular is that Rand writes very little directly about friendship in her nonfiction. As we saw with that example, I think it's clearly present throughout her novels. It comes up a lot. So, for example, you can think about Rourke and Wynand in The Fountainhead, Francisco, Galt, and Ragnar in Atlas Shrugged, Dagny and Eddie when they're children, right, in Atlas Shrugged, Rourke and Mike, Rourke and Steve and Mallory. And I do think that a clear view of some of the core philosophical values of friendship emerges from considering these examples. So what I'd like to do here is to consider what is the nature of that view of the philosophical value of friendship that we get from Rand, and how can it help us learn how to value friendship in a more purposeful and integrated way. I do want to note briefly that there are some aspects of friendship that I won't discuss here. So there's a lot of values in friendship that are not necessarily relevant to my talk today. So for example, there's aspects of building trust, resolving conflict, how to build intimacy, things like that. Instead, I'm going to focus on what I take to be two of the core foundational values of friendship, which are visibility and inspiration. So let's start with visibility. And I do want to note briefly, I think this term, as far as I can tell, originally comes from Nathaniel Branden's work. But I do think it's, again, clearly underlying how Rand thinks about human relationships. And so it's not clear, did he get it from her, that idea? Did she develop it in part alongside him, or however? I'm not sure. But it's a very useful term, as we'll see, to think about this concept. I once went with a friend to the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. It's one of my favorite museums. And we entered the room that had my favorite painting in it. And I asked my friend to guess which painting in the room was my favorite. And she looked around for a minute or two, and then she pointed at it. The Broken Pitcher by Bouguereau. I love this painting so much. It's so brilliant. And what I felt in that moment was that my friend really saw something about my character. She really got something about me without me having to tell her. She understood that I loved paintings that depicted really emotionally intense and intimate scenes, that I loved depictions of human beauty, that I loved paintings that depicted vivid realism. So if you note, for example, the realism in the feet and hands, which I think Bouguereau is especially expert at. And so I felt in that moment a kind of visibility from my friend understanding all of that without me having to tell any of it to her. This is another example from Atlas Shrugged that I also love. So recall, this is the moment when at Reardon's Mines, there's a breakout of liquid iron. Okay, so this is told from the perspective of Reardon. And with no time to know it, but knowing it, seizing it with his senses past the censorship of his mind, he was seeing a black silhouette with red rays shooting from behind its shoulders, its elbows, its angular curves, the red rays circling through steam like the long needles of spotlights, following the movements of a swift, expert, confident being whom he had never seen before except in evening clothes under the lights of ballrooms. There was no time to form words, to think, to explain. But he knew that this was the real Francisco d'Anconia, that this was what he had seen from the first and loved. The word did not shock him because there was no word in his mind. There was only a joyous feeling that seemed like a flow of energy added to his own. To the rhythm of his body, with the scorching heat on his face and the winter night on his shoulder blades, he was seeing suddenly that this was the simple essence of his universe. The instantaneous refusal to submit to disaster, the irresistible drive to fight it, the triumphant feeling of his own ability to win. He was certain that Francisco felt it too, that he had been moved by the same impulse, that it was right to feel it, right for both of them to be what they were. He caught glimpses of a sweat-streaked face, intent upon action, and it was the most joyous face he had ever seen. I really tried to shorten this quote, but it's just so good that I just had to have the whole thing because it's so brilliant. But notice that what Reardon is experiencing in that moment, he's seeing suddenly the simple essence of his universe by observing Francisco. It's by observing Francisco's confident action, the refusal to submit to disaster, that Reardon's able to see that about himself, that he shares that same essence of character. To sharpen this point, consider situations in which we don't feel this kind of visibility. Once I was exchanging Christmas gifts with a friend, and I particularly love romantic novels like those of Victor Hugo. So I love novels with characters whose choices and values are driving the plot, driving the conflict. And a friend gave me a book by Karl Ove Knausgaard. I don't know if you guys know that novelist, but he's a Norwegian writer. But if you haven't read him, basically it reads like the diary of a petulant 12-year-old who grows up into a petulant adult. I couldn't resist the dig. So. And here's another example from the Fountainhead, which I love. And sorry for these long quotes. I love these moments so much. I just feel like I really couldn't shorten them. This is the moment where Gail Wynan falls in love for the first time. And this is another example of not feeling visible. The girl with whom he fell in love had an exquisite beauty, a beauty to be worshipped, not desired. She was fragile and silent. Her face told of lovely mysteries within her, left unexpressed. She became Gail Wynan's mistress. He allowed himself the weakness of being happy. He would have married her at once had she mentioned it, but they said little to each other. He felt that everything was understood between them. One evening he spoke, sitting at her feet, his face raised to her. He allowed his soul to be heard. My darling, anything you wish, anything I am, anything I can ever be. That is what I want to offer you. Not the things I'll get for you, but the things in me that will make me able to get them. That thing, a man can't renounce it, but I want to renounce it so that it will be yours, so that it will be in your service, only for you. The girl smiled and asked, do you think I'm prettier than Maggie Kelly? He got up and he said nothing and walked out of the house. He never saw that girl again. So yeah, wow, like what an incredible exposition of not feeling visible. So he's basically revealing his soul to her. He's bearing his soul to her in that moment, and she completely misses the point. So what's going on here? What is visibility? Well, when someone values what you value, when they notice what you notice and get excited by what you get excited by, when they form similar judgments about art, about other people, about ideas, about things you're doing together, it's like you have a mirror of your own soul made visible in another person. And so when you spend time with that person, you can get a clear perspective on yourself by seeing them, by observing them. So if you think about my example of going to the art museum, think about the difference between if you're going to an art museum by yourself and this particular kind of perspective you can have from going with someone, with a close friend, and appreciating things that they're doing, maybe observations they're making, how they're bringing their knowledge and values into looking at different paintings, how they're drawn to certain paintings over others. And in addition, to use that same example, in the course of spending time with someone at an art museum, you also have many opportunities for explicit recognition, right? So in my example, I noticed that my friend was particularly observant, and I told her that. And that explicit recognition is also an aspect of visibility. So this is the value of visibility that we get in friendship. And this core idea originally comes from Aristotle, from Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And there are some interesting quotes here that reveal how he's thinking about visibility. Aristotle writes, "There's a dispute about whether a happy person will need friends or not. People say that those who are blessed and self-sufficient have no need of friends, since they already have the things that are good. And being self-sufficient need nothing further. But a friend, since he is another self, provides what a person cannot provide by himself." Okay, so what is that thing that you can't provide by yourself? Well, if being happy consists in living and engaging in activity, and the activity of a good person is good and pleasant in itself, as we said at the beginning, and if what is our own is pleasant, and this is key, if we are better able to contemplate our neighbors than ourselves, and their actions than our own, and if the good person finds pleasure in the actions of good people who are his friends, then the blessed person will need friends like this, since he rationally chooses to contemplate actions that are good and his own, and the actions of a good person who is his friend are like this. Okay, so this is very wordy and somewhat complicated, but the core idea is pretty simple, I think. The idea is that we are better able to contemplate our neighbors than ourselves. Why? Well, we can't have an instantly or directly perceivable form of our own character as an object, right? We only can introspect. When we think about our character, all we can do is introspect, and we can appreciate our character as a subject, but not as an object. So, for example, when you do introspect, you find that you can think about your emotions, your beliefs, your choices, your reactions to things. But since you can't have the experience of directly seeing your character, very often first of all, there are character qualities that we sometimes miss entirely. But also, and more to the point, there's an aesthetic perspective on ourselves that we lack because we can't fully appreciate something by looking at it as an object. And here's another example that I love that I think illustrates this point of missing or lacking an appreciation of something about yourself. So this is the moment where Francisco meets Reardon. And he says, "You stood here and watched the storm with the greatest pride one can ever feel." This is Francisco speaking. "Because you are able to have summer flowers and half-naked women in your house on a night like this, in demonstration of your victory over that storm. And if it weren't for you, most of those who are here would be left helpless at the mercy of that wind in the middle of some such plain." "How did you know that?" Reardon responds. In time with his question, Reardon realized that it was not his thoughts this man had named, but his most hidden, most personal emotion. And that he, who would never confess his emotions to anyone, had confessed it in his question. He saw the faintest flicker in Francisco's eyes, as of a smile or a check mark. And so part of what's happening here is Reardon's character is being made more visible to himself, right? By Francisco conveying in a clear identification the essentialized meaning of the productive virtue that Reardon has and how he was feeling about it. And it's not that Reardon didn't have that emotion or wasn't experiencing that, right? But now he's experiencing it more clearly. He can more clearly appreciate it. And I want to note that there are two distinct aspects of visibility here. So you might have picked up on that already. Right? First, there's the visibility that comes from spending time with people that we admire and that are similar to us, that share similar values to us, and thereby getting a clear perspective on ourselves just from being around them, right? You can think of that as a mirroring component. A person serves as a mirror to us when we spend time with them. And I think that's actually the aspect of visibility that Aristotle was most focused on. But then there's the explicit recognition of that by a friend. So going back to the moment with Dagny, there's the explicit recognition by Daniger of certain qualities in Dagny by saying that well done. That part of the meaning of that. So what is happening in that example? So if we go back, so if we think about her inner life, right, if we think about this point of there's something she can't clearly perceive about herself, well, when in the course of her work, she can introspect and she has different thoughts and beliefs and judgments. So for example, she's planning routes for the railroad. She's solving problems. She feels different emotions, pride, excitement about Reardon Medal, for example. And what is she getting from Ken Daniger? Well, Ken Daniger is a man that she respects for his integrity and his dedication to his work. And so in being around him, in being in conversation with him, she can already see something in herself that she values. And then in being explicitly, having those qualities explicitly recognized by him makes it easier for her to appreciate, or possible in this objective way, for her to appreciate those qualities in herself. Objective in the sense of she can perceive it as an object, right? And I think both components are really crucial here, right? So the value of being around Ken Daniger is partly based in the fact that he does actually embody that integrity in his work, in his dedication. But I think the recognitional component is needed. You could think of it as it's needed in part as giving her the kind of certainty that the mirroring is taking place. So, for example, if you were spending time with a friend all the time who you admired, who you shared similar values with, as I did at the art museum, but there was never any kind of explicit recognition of, oh, I love how observant you are, or I love the way you think about paintings. At a certain point, it would become hard to feel certain or sure that the mirroring is genuine or authentic. To take another example, consider when Howard Roark meets Stephen Mallory. When Roark goes to Mallory's studio, right, he notes that he says something to Stephen Mallory about the meaning of Mallory's own sculptures, right? That he genuinely loves Mallory's work because they express a celebration of human potential and greatness. And that's part of what bonds their friendship, right? Is Mallory feeling understood without him having had to tell Roark that, like what the meaning of his own paintings are. Or his own sculptures are, excuse me. Okay, so what does this visibility do? Why is it so important? And I've already given some indications of that, but from a philosophical perspective, how can we clarify that? Well, it gives us a kind of energy and rejuvenation, the pleasure of appreciating more clearly qualities that we admire in ourselves. And I think you could say, therefore, that it's an important source of both pleasure and of self-knowledge. So it gives us a certain kind of increased awareness of ourselves, a certain kind of self-knowledge. But it's also, as Aristotle noted, it's really joyous and pleasant, and as you've seen in these examples. And why do we need this kind of pleasure? Well, we need this kind of pleasure, I think, as a reward for virtuous actions. So the pleasure of more clearly in seeing and recognizing our own achievements in character is part of what gives us the energy and motivation to continue engaging in virtuous action. And notice also that when we think about it from this perspective, visibility is more important and more possible the more egoistic that one is, right? The more ambitiously egoistic one is, the more that one has a self, because the more that your values are deeply held, the more that the activities you're engaging in say something more about yourself, right? So, for example, I have a friend who designed an app for 3D modeling. And it took him many years. And he had to try many different flawed iterations of it over and over before he could make something that was workable and marketable. And precisely because that goal was so abstract and so many of the rewards associated with it were in the distant future, he had to have that perseverance seen and appreciated by his friends. But if you take a contrast, think about a character like Peter Keating, right? Is there a possibility of Peter Keating getting this kind of visibility from friendship? His life and choices and his values are all the products of the opinions and evaluations of others, right? So his career, he chooses to please his mother. His friends, he chooses to flatter his false sense of self-esteem and to appear to be popular and admirable. And even his romantic relationship with Dominique, he chooses on the basis of prestige over a woman that he genuinely has affection for. I think because of his actions, it's debatable whether you could say he actually loves her, but he clearly has some kind of actual affection for her. And the visibility that true friendship can offer is simply not available to Peter Keating. And Peter Keating is a particularly interesting case because we see throughout the Fountainhead that he spends time with Rourke, and he gets a sense that there's something authentic about the way Rourke is in the world. But he can't access, Rourke is not able to give him the kind of visibility that they could have in a true friendship. He can't access that. And obviously, if we take Rourke by contrast, it's a completely different situation. Rourke seeks out people who celebrate and appreciate his buildings precisely because they say so much about him as a person. He holds his approach to building as a deep and intense personal value, right? His approach to having buildings that have a specific integration and a specific nature. So again, there's a world of difference between what Keating is seeking in the admiration or approval from others and the visibility that Rourke is seeking in his friendships with Gail Winan, Stephen Mallory, and Mike, and so on. Okay, so and one more example that I wanted to bring up. When Rourke meets Mike, they bond over specifically their admiration of Henry Cameron, right? And the fact that they take building really seriously. But there's something that I've left out here, which is that the visibility is highly particular as well, right? So it's not as though Rourke is just seeking, I'm seeking productive people, or I'm seeking courageous people. He seeks people, or he bonds with people in a sense of life, on the basis of a sense of life, right? When he meets Mike, for example, he's particularly drawn to Mike's prickly responses and surprise at Mike's surprise at Rourke's ability to solve a problem that Mike himself couldn't solve, right? Because he distrusts architects. And Rourke likes that. That's part of what binds them to the friendship. I don't think you could leave that out, right? So there is something highly particular in friendship that's really important when we think about how visibility comes up. And what this suggests, if we're thinking about how do we value friendship for ourselves, is that friendship, to be deeply appreciated requires specifying the basis of the visibility. The visibility can't merely be shared, can't and is not merely shared in terms of abstract philosophical or moral values. Again, if you take the example of Gail Wynand and Howard Rourke, Wynand is drawn to Rourke because of the specific kind of buildings that he loves that Rourke makes, right? The uncompromising straight lines. Rourke's particularly principled approach to architecture, how he makes sure to have a building that has a specific purpose and integration every time he approaches a new building. And so what this suggests is that if we're thinking about how to approach friendship, we need to think about what's the specific kind of visibility that we're able to offer to people, and what's the specific kind of visibility that we're receiving. So I think we can think of this in just terms of questions that we could raise for ourselves about how we're approaching friendship. So if you're thinking about visibility to yourself, or the kind of visibility you're receiving from a friend, think about, in what way does a friend make you feel visible, or could make you feel visible? For example, is it emotionally? So you might get emotional visibility from a friend recognizing how you feel after a breakup, right? They know how you were excited about a particular person because they've followed your narrative of meeting a person you were really excited by. And they know that you have to now reintegrate and reprogram some of those emotions. You have to temper that excitement that you felt about that person that you're not compatible with. Or in my example in the art museum case, the visibility in how you value art. And it might be about paintings, it might be about films, it might be about music. But think about how you want to and can be seen in those different domains. For example, I felt seen in my love for the celebration of the human figure and the vivid realism in those paintings with my friend. Or would it be intellectually, right? You might get intellectual visibility from a friend on the basis of having conversations about philosophy or history or economics. And then being able to state the value of that visibility and the basis of that visibility and its value explicitly is very valuable, not just for the sake of appreciating it and understanding the friendship, but also understanding what kinds of activities can contribute more to that kind of visibility. And I think a point that is, especially maybe because people like us are drawn to egoism, I think is easier to miss sometimes, is what's the visibility that you're offering to your friends? And I think it can be just easy to not think about that. I certainly have had that problem in the past. But it's worth asking those same kinds of questions. So what kind of visibility are you offering to your friend? And what kind of visibility are you not offering to your friend? What opportunities could there be for offering different types of visibility? For example, maybe you only have conversations with your friends or your activities center around your careers, right? And so you can give them a lot of visibility on how they think about their productiveness and their ambition and their goals, but less about relationships. And maybe there's an opportunity to see their ambitiousness and purposefulness in those other domains. So in general, I think there's a huge value here to being able to state the basis of visibility, both that you're receiving and offering to a friend. So let's move to the next core value of friendship, which is inspiration. And inspiration I understand as the contemplation and stimulation to pursue values. that are brought on by seeing values one admires in another person. So what's a good example of this? So one example that I found from Atlas Shrugged that I thought illustrated this point really well was, this is also when Dagny's first in the valley. And Francisco and John Galt are showing her the valley. I think in this particular scene, Francisco is showing them his mines and the progress he's making. She noticed that Francisco is displaying his domain to Galt as much as to her, as much or more. You haven't seen it since last year, John. John, wait till you see it a year from now. I'll be through outside in just a few months, and then this will be my full-time job. Dagny remarks, you're wasting an unconscionable amount of manpower and time carting your ore on muleback. You ought to build a railroad down to the valley. She was looking down and did not notice the sudden, eager shot of his glance to her face, or the sound of caution in his voice. I know it, but it's such a difficult job that the mine's output won't justify it at present. Nonsense, it's much simpler than it looks. There's a pass to the east where there's an easier grade and softer stone. I watched it on the way up. It wouldn't take so many curves. 3 miles of rail or less would do it. She was pointing east and did not notice the intensity with which the two men were watching her face. So I think what this scene illustrates is they're getting excited about watching Dagny's mind in action, right? They're getting excited seeing her think about the value potential that they're missing out on and how she would solve those problems. And in essence, they're getting inspiration from her display of confidence and competence in how she would address that problem. To take another example, there was once a friend that I hadn't spoken to in a while, and in catching up with him, he was telling me about a new business idea that he was working on, which was he was designing a specific kind of racing bike. It was actually based on those British Brompton bicycles that he was transforming into a kind of like racing level bike. And there were so many aspects of making that into a business that he was telling me about. So for example, how he was choosing different materials, right? How he was managing the costs, how he was controlling for the weight of the bike, because it had to be as light as possible. How did the bike look? Thinking about like the aesthetics of the bike. Was it comfortable? And in the course of that conversation, and I'm sure many of us have had examples like this, I found myself getting really excited, both for him and thinking, wow, like I can't wait to like get back to some of the values I'm pursuing. I can't wait to get back to some of the compositions I'm working on or a paper that I'm writing, and approach it with that same attention to detail and zest and excitement. And so what is this value of inspiration that we get from friends, and why is it important? And I think it's actually quite similar to why we need visibility. I think there's a similar aspect of human nature we can point to here, which is that we are only pursuing our values from our own perspective. And when we have friends who we admire, who we can observe their value pursuits intimately, it gives us more opportunities to see values succeeding in action. Not just moral values in the abstract sense, although those are relevant, such as courage and productiveness and so on, but also aesthetic values. So for example, consider people who are friends who make similar kinds of art. So people who are friends who both make music or who both paint, or who have similar lifestyles, like people who bond over traveling or different kinds of sports that they do together, or personal values. So I don't have children, but I see a lot of my friends who have children developing friendships with other people that have children. And I think a big part of that is the inspiration from being able to see and get excited about seeing their friends engaged in those same kinds of activities. And so when you have that kind of intimate awareness of other value pursuits in action and achievements as well, like you see your friends succeeding, it gives you a kind of energy and inspiration to pursue your own values. I think this is part of what's happening, again, to go back to the example with Rourke and Mike. Rourke enjoys watching Mike because of his dedication to doing his work well. And I think the same is true of Mike with Rourke, right? They mention, it's mentioned in the book that Mike thereafter goes to work on all of Rourke's buildings. And there's clearly a kind of trade of inspiration there. And again, I think, as I think some of the examples I've given have illustrated, the inspiration is highly particular, right? And I think part of the work of friendship, when we think from the perspective of how we might deepen friendships we have, or how we might pursue friendships more egoistically, is finding the particular ways that you can be inspired by others. So for example, Rourke found a person that admires buildings in the systematic way that he does. And they bond over admiring a particular person, Henry Cameron. And this is a value of friendship that's not automatic. The spiritual investment of time and thought into friendship is partly what serves as the source of inspiration. And I think it's also the ability to give your friend inspiration that allows you to earn theirs as part of a spiritual trade. So I'm recalling Rand's idea here that, and I didn't put this quote up, but that love, friendship, respect, and admiration are the emotional response of one man to the virtues of another. The spiritual payment that you give in exchange for the personal, selfish pleasure which one man derives from the virtues of another man's character. And I think that way of thinking about that trade, that definition, captures this idea of inspiration that I'm talking about. And again, it's, although sometimes it can be experienced as automatic, in general, inspiration comes from a kind of investment of time of getting to know someone and understanding how they're pursuing values, the dedication with which they're pursuing values. And in particular, being invested in sort of the dynamics and growth of their values over time. So for example, I have a friend who's pursuing a career in academic philosophy. And part of the value of our friendship, for me, comes from having had countless conversations with him about how he thinks about his work, studying early modern philosophy, new perspectives he's learning in thinking about epistemology, how he's learning about scholarship and learning how to present at conferences and managing his time and so on. And all of that can serve as inspiration precisely because I'm intimately aware of his value pursuit. And I have a perspective of it over time, and I become emotionally invested in it. And I think this is what it means to value a friend for their own sake. So I mentioned that term before. And that idea also I got from Aristotle. And why does this imply valuing a friend for their own sake? Well, it's because you're valuing them as an end, as a life process. You care about their ends, not in the exact same way as they do, but in a third personal way, you become invested in the ends that they're pursuing as well. And this recalls, there's a place where Rand mentions that I think it's in the Ethics of Emergencies, that part of what it means to value a friend or to value another human being is that you incorporate their welfare into your hierarchy of values. but you're incorporating them as an end. And again, to clarify, this doesn't mean that a friend is intrinsically valuable, as though you are treating them divorced from your personal context of choices and goals and values. But what it does mean is that you don't experience the friendship as a basis of seeking something separate from it, or something that you're getting out of it. So for example, Rourke is not friends with Gail Wynand because it's advancing his career, nor is he friends with Gail Wynand even because he's getting some kind of feeling of, good feeling of validation or excitement or whatever from getting seen by Gail Wynand, even though that might be part of the experience. The time that they spend together is experienced as an end in itself, as something having for its own, worth having for its own sake and appreciating for its own sake. So I'm sure we're aware of the importance of choosing friends that are dedicated to their values. But I think what the point about inspiration suggests, and the particularity of inspiration, is that we should approach it with an explorer's mindset. So think about what kinds of value pursuit might be inspiring that you haven't thought of, that your friends are engaged in or potential friends are engaged in. So for example, perhaps you have a friend that engages in rock climbing, and you could get inspiration from thinking about how they spend time trying to master different finger holds and learning how to balance their body in different ways to solve different problems. Or you have a friend that plays jazz piano, and you might get inspiration from understanding the particular ways that he studies his favorite pianists and incorporates their phrasing into his soloing, right? So the point is that you might not always be aware of the particular ways that inspiration comes up. And I think having an exploratory mindset with regard to that is very valuable. Okay, so I think, how much time do I have left? I think I'm going to go a couple minutes. I'm going to have to cut this a little shorter, but because I want to leave some time for questions. So I just want to address like one clarification, and I think natural misconception that we can have about friendship, that I think actually Aristotle maybe arguably makes this mistake, which is that you might think that friendship being a trade means that there needs to be some kind of equality in the friendship. So there needs to be some kind of equality of investment, perhaps, or that friends need to be equally visible to each other or equally inspired to each other. But I think we should reject that perspective. I don't think friendship requires or implies a need for any kind of balance or equality in any of those aspects that I've mentioned. And I think a good illustration of this is the friendship between Dagny and Eddie, right? What's the kind of visibility that Dagny gets from Eddie? Well, Eddie clearly recognizes that Dagny is a person of immense productive ability. He understands that Taggart Transcontinental is running because of her, that it's her competence and dedication, and also her ability to recognize greatness in others, right? The greatness in Ellis Wyatt, the potential of Reardon Metal, how she's unfazed by the arbitrary criticisms of Reardon Metal before it's in use from the media and from Jim Taggart and from others. And she relies on her own independent judgment. But he can't give her the kind of visibility that someone like Reardon can or someone like Francisco can. And that's not just because of the romantic element. We can set that aside. It's, or Ken Daniger, maybe that's the better example that I started with. he can't give her the kind of recognition that, or visibility that Ken Daniger can, precisely because his productive ability is simply not similar enough to Dagny's to understand what it's like to be a person of that incredible productive ability. And obviously that's not a moral failing. It just means that their friendship doesn't have that kind of visibility. And nor is it a failure of their friendship. It just means that their friendship has a different dynamic or a different flavor to it, you could say. So I think in general, and I think this point applies to inspiration as well. Friendships do not have to have an equality of inspiration, nor do the bases of visibility and inspiration have to range over the same things. So I might offer a friend intellectual visibility by talking to them about the ideas they consider important and so on. That gives them an appreciation on that. Whereas the visibility they give me might be primarily emotional or primarily on the basis of my competence in some other areas, like how I think about art or something like that. I think this is related to the explorer mindset, and it also relates to a growth mindset, that what's important in friendship is not that there's a kind of equality, but that insofar as we value the friend, insofar as we value the friendship, we seek to deepen and expand the kinds of inspiration and visibility that are there. But it's not about measuring them in some kind of balance, right? I think when we think about, again, having a growth mindset, it's thinking about what are the different kinds of activities you could engage in together that would deepen that kind of friendship. What are the kinds of conversations that you could have that could expand the kind of visibility and inspiration you could offer? So in sum, I think Rand's perspective on friendship, that again we have to somewhat extract from the novels, gives us a rich and unique view of friendship that can be highly purposeful and ambitious. And the joint values of visibility and inspiration are the foundation of egoistic friendship, I would argue. They make life easier and richer and more rewarding and exciting through being able to appreciate ourselves and people that are worth admiring. I want to end with a scene from The Fountainhead that I think captures the beauty and serenity of true friendship. Can we put that quote on the, put that quote up? Thanks. And this is after while they're working on the starter temple to the human spirit, if you recall. After the day's work, 4 people would often remain at the site: Rourke, Mallory, Dominique, and Mike Donegan. Mike had not missed employment on a single building of Rourke's. The 4 of them sat together in Mallory's shack after all the others had left. A wet cloth covered the unfinished statue. The door of the shack stood open to the first warmth of a spring night. A tree branch hung outside with 3 new leaves against the black sky, stars trembling like drops of water on the edges of the leaves. There were no chairs in the shack. Mallory stood at the cast iron stove fixing hot dogs and coffee. Mike sat at the model stand, smoking a pipe. Rourke lay stretched out on the floor, propped up on his elbows. Dominique sat on a kitchen stool, a thin silk robe wrapped about her, her bare feet on the planks of the floor. They did not speak about their work. Mallory told outrageous stories, and Dominique laughed like a child. They talked about nothing in particular, sentences that only had meaning in the sound of the voices, in the warm gaiety, in the ease of complete relaxation. They were simply 4 people who liked being there together. The walls rising in the darkness beyond the open door gave sanction to their rest, gave them the right to lightness. The building on which they had all worked together, the building that was like a low, audible harmony to the sound of their voices. Rourke laughed as Dominique had never seen him laugh anywhere else, his mouth loose and young. Thank you.
Something stood out as you're talking about visibility and inspiration that seems like you can get something similar from a healthy rivalry competition, especially in like a more like positively agonistic culture like ancient Greece. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like the way a good rival, somebody who's in your field, maybe working on the same kind of thing that you're trying to, compare yourselves against each other, especially like in a sports context. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so the thing about the idea of visibility, and I think this is an example of that, is you might think, well, in a broad sense, we can get visibility from all sorts of different situations, right? I mean, you can get visibility from a therapist, right? You get someone who is helping you think about your character. You can get visibility on yourself from, like you read Atlas Shrugged. That a lot of people have this moment where they say, oh, this affirms something that I had already believed. And I think examples like competition are another example. Yeah, like you can get visibility on your athletic competence, for example, if you're like racing with someone or you're lifting weights together or something like that. But that's not the same kind of that's not visibility on your character in the same way that you're getting from a friend. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I think the difference is that when you're open to intimacy with someone through like knowing them and trusting them, there's a deeper meaning to like how much you can see about them. I think in the case of an athletic case, I think there is a kind of visibility there. I think you could extend the concept to those kinds of cases. But you're seeing yourself in sort of a specific domain and not like as a whole person.
Right.
Whereas with your friend, because they understand you and because they understand your character, there's a sense in which they're seeing your whole person, even though in that particular situation, it might be that a specific aspect of your character is highlighted. I think it's important that they know who you are as a whole person, right. And that colors that situation.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Salutations. Throughout the talk, you're referencing both Ayn Rand and Aristotle's view of friendship. Outside of the issue of balance and equality in friendships, what are some other key ways in which Ayn Rand and Aristotle disagree on the matters of friendship?
Well, I think a significant limitation in Aristotle's view, and maybe you could sense it from those quotes, is that there's something really impersonal about Aristotle. And I think that's something that extends throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, is that the whole perspective on life is you want to build a life for yourself where you're doing things in the right way and you're managing your character, you're managing external goods and resources, and then you engage in contemplation of eternal philosophical truths that are worth thinking about. And then it's like, oh, and then you need friends in order to like appreciate the fact that you're doing all that stuff. But there's something really like missing about that, right? Which is compared to Rand, you're missing the whole personal component, I think, with Aristotle. You're missing the idea that part of what Rourke likes about Mike is he likes how Mike is prickly to him when they first interact, when he's like working on the building, and he likes the aggressive nature of it. He likes how defiant Stephen Mallory is. Like he doesn't even care that Stephen Mallory tried to kill Ellsworth Toohey, for example, right? Like, Rourke likes that. Like, so like, I think what you are missing with Aristotle is that the choice of friends and the pursuit of friendship is a highly personal value, and it's not a moral issue. There's a sense of life issue of there's specific feelings about existence and feelings about how you do things and what's important that resonates with you with particular people. And it's not just like, oh, you go around finding someone who's virtuous and then you can think about your own virtue. It's much more personal than that. So I would say that's the biggest difference. Yeah. And I think we're out of time, so we have to end there.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.